Hello and welcome to Chapter 3 of my Halloween story, Widicker Woods. If you have not heard Chapters 1 and 2, please go back and listen to those first so you know what's going on. With that being said, let's get started right where we left off. Here we go. Then they heard someone talking nearby. They looked and saw a faint candlelight glow coming from down the hall and around the corner. They turned the corner and saw it was Nick and the girls. Nick explained that Benjamin was attacked by Dracula. "We know," Joe replied. "We had a close talk with him already." "Well, we got to get the hell out of here," Felicia screamed. Thankful she was okay, Joe walked up and kissed Tabitha and hugged her. He looked at everyone else and told Jake to walk in the front with him, and he instructed Nick and Thomas to be in the back of the line and the girls be in the middle so that they could be protected. He gave Nick a gun, and they began to walk. "Okay, we're going to go downstairs and try to sneak out the back quietly." Joe assured them everything would be okay as long as everyone stuck together and was quiet. They began to walk down the squeaky stairs. "I'm scared. What if Dracula comes back for one of us? He'll take the youngest one first, which is me. I know he will," Vanessa cried out. "We'll protect you," Nick replied to her. They were almost down the staircase when they heard bats flying down the hall and screeching upstairs. "It's them!" Tabitha screamed. They turned back into bats. "Run as fast as you can to the back doors," Joe commanded. So they began to sprint through the house looking for the back doors. They finally seen them with the moonlight glowing through them. Just as they got up to the glass of the French doors, Vanessa tried to open them, but they were locked. Her and Felicia tugged on the doors, but they would not budge. Joe told them to step back so he could shoot the glass, shattering the door so they could step through it and escape. But just as he aimed his pistol at the door, Dracula appeared in front of him. Everyone screamed and jumped back. "Leaving so soon? I don't think so," screamed Dracula. With that, Joe pointed his gun at the glass door behind Dracula and shot the glass, causing big pieces to shatter to the ground. Dracula hissed with his fangs. So Joe quickly picked up a big shard of glass about 8 inches long. Dracula came at Joe to attack him, but Joe shoved the shard of glass deep into Dracula's chest as hard as he could, penetrating his heart. "Ah!" Dracula screamed in pain, because he knew that he had been mortally wounded. Adiella and her sisters appeared back in human form and kneeled down beside Dracula. They began to weep, saying, "Master!" Then Dracula's body dehydrated and his skin sucked up against his bones as he died. Joe rushed everyone through the broken door. He looked down at Adiella and her sisters as they cried over their master's body. Adiella looked up in tears and revenge in her eyes and said, "I'm going to kill you. You may have gotten out of this house, but I'll see to it that you never get out of Widicker Woods, or the town of Widicker." Joe pulled out his rifle and hit her in the face with the butt of his gun. "That's for threatening me," he said. He then took one last look at them and turned and walked out the door himself. They began to walk through the dark, foggy pasture. The rain had momentarily stopped, but it was still lightning. They walked through the mud and water puddles for about a mile when suddenly Joe ran into something hard like a giant rock. He felt on the object and identified it as a tombstone. They lit up a lamp to see better through the fog. "It's a graveyard," said Tabitha. "And a really big one too," Felicia added. It looked as if the graveyard was about as long as a football field. "Stay close, everyone," Joe told them as they began to walk slowly through the creepy cemetery. Then they began to hear the rumble of thunder again. "Oh, great. It's going to start raining again," Vanessa said. "I think that's the last of our worries," Joe told her. "Why?" "Look ahead," Joe replied. Everyone stopped and saw through the foggy boneyard what appeared to be Yankee and rebel soldiers slowly walking towards them. "Oh, good," Felicia said. "Soldiers, they can help us." "No, These soldiers won't be helping us because they're already dead." Then they began to hear tombstones breaking, and the ground began to shake. They heard thunder rumbling furiously. They began to see the graves of the fallen soldiers as the fog cleared, and the tombstones began to fall over, and the soil on the graves began to pulse up and down as if they had a heartbeat of their own. It began to rain again, harder than before. Then a hand popped out of a grave by Nick, and it grabbed him by the ankle. He had a gun and he tried shooting into the grave, but the hand began to pull him down into the grave. The dirt on the grave had become like quicksand as Nick screamed. Joe and Thomas grabbed his arms and tried to keep him from going underground. While they were doing this, Tabitha screamed, "Hurry! People are coming from out of their graves!" "They're zombies!" screamed Samantha. Joe threw them his gun. "Here! Shoot them!" Joe and Thomas were pulling Nick with all their force, but the zombie in the grave pulled even harder. Nick began to scream in pain as if something were attacking him. "They're eating my legs!" he screamed. Nick screamed in terror as he began to sink down lower. Joe struggled to hold on to Nick's arm. With all the rain and mud, his hands kept slipping, loosening his grip. Then Nick began to come up as Joe and Thomas pulled with all of their might. But then suddenly Nick's arms ripped off as they were pulling him up. Nick screamed as loud as he could and was sucked underneath the ground with the zombie. Joe then stood back up and took his gun from Tabitha. He began to shoot at them, but the bullets hit their torso seemed to do nothing. "Why won't they die?" he screamed in desperation. "Nothing dies in Widicker Woods," screamed Samantha. "Bullshit!" Joe yelled as he snatched a sword from a zombie colonel's side. He raised the sword and began to swing it, chopping off zombie heads and their arms. "It may not kill them, but at least they're harmless without those things, so they can't bite or scratch us." Jake grabbed a sword from another soldier and began to do the same thing. "Run!" they told the girls. As they ran, a hand popped out of a grave and grabbed Tabitha by the ankle. "Joe!" she screamed. It began to pull her under, but Joe was surrounded by two zombies. He was trying to cut them and keep them off of him. "Help!" she screamed. Joe fought fiercely to get to her. Felicia and Vanessa grabbed her arms as it pulled her. She was down in the dirt to her knees when suddenly two men appeared. One had a sword and cut the zombie's arms off of Tabitha's leg. And the men pulled her from the grave, saving her life. When Joe got to her, she was crying. Joe looked at the two men. They were white, both wearing cowboy hats, and had a big mustache. The other had long hair and a mustache. "Who are y'all? Yankees or rebels?" "Neither," the one with the big mustache said. "My name's Pastor Toby, and this here's feller's name is Tracy. He's a singer, and I'm a cowboy preacher." "Okay, how did y'all end up in Widicker Woods?" asked Joe. "Well, you see, me and Tracy were up at the church rehearsing some worship songs when some soldiers came in and tied us up, threw us in their wagon," said Pastor Toby. "Yeah, and then they set the church on fire and shot our horses, threw a bag over our faces. We rode in their wagon for about an hour, and I was asked, 'Are y'all going to kill us?' And they told me no, but we're going to take you to a place that'll make you wish we had killed you," said Tracy. "Yeah, and that's when we ended up here in these woods. They threw us out of their wagon, and all kind of stuff has happened to us," Pastor Toby added. "Whatever you do, don't go walking through the cornfield. There's a scarecrow man out there who will try to kill you. He's made of hay, and we even set him on fire, but he still came after us." "Okay, well, you guys look like you can be trusted, so come with us," Joe told them. When they walked out of the haunted cemetery, they were back into the heavily wooded area. It wasn't raining on them as bad. As they walked under all the trees, and once again the temperature had seemed to drop with all the rain. Oh, and with all the rain, they had become extremely cold. Every man grab a woman and hold her close to you. If you have a big cloak, give it to her and wrap it around her. Both of you to stay warm, Joe told them. Then he himself grabbed Tabitha and his coat and gave her his coat so she could stay warm. They began to hear wolves howling again. Great, the wolves are back, Joe thought to himself. All right, man, be prepared to shoot if you see a wolf, Joe told them. And it's a full moon, Felicia said. The howls got closer. Joe told everyone to stop and brace themselves. They stopped and stared off into the darkness. They heard something move through the trees, getting closer and closer. But they couldn't see anything. Then all the noise stopped as they stood there surrounded by total darkness and drizzling rain. Suddenly a giant beast jumped out of the woods in front of them. The men began to shoot at it and everyone took off running as the beast followed. It's a werewolf! Tracy screamed as he ran, looking back, shooting at it. Everyone began to split up, leaving the girls vulnerable. Stay together! Joe and Pastor Toby yelled. Protect the girls! Tracy, Jake, and Thomas ran ahead of everyone like scared cowards. Joe and Toby stayed with the girls, still looking back, shooting at the werewolf, nipping at their heels. Suddenly, Jake fell after tripping over a tree root that was sticking up out of the ground. Get up! Joe yelled as they approached him. Jake got to his feet and tried to run, but he fell again because his ankle was broken. He turned around and laid on the ground and began to shoot the werewolf as it raced behind the others, drooling for blood. He fired 4 shots as Joe and the others passed him. The werewolf spotted him on the ground and stopped chasing the others. They heard Jake scream, and as they looked back, they saw the werewolf raise his sharp claws and slash them across Nick's face. Blood began to spray out of Jake's face all over the werewolf. The werewolf then clawed Jake's stomach, ripping it open, spilling his intestines. Jake tried to scream, but gargled in his own blood as he died. The werewolf looked up at the full moon and howled, and then it buried its face in Jake's stomach and began to eat him while he was still alive. Meanwhile, Joe and the others had gotten far away from the gruesome scene that they had found. They had found a wide opening in the woods, and they were near a pond. They stopped running and tried to catch their breath as it rained on them. The girls began to cry because of what they had just seen happen. I really like Jake. I've known him for a long time, Vanessa said as she cried. Joe looked at her and said, Jake was a coward. He left us. He'd have let you have the same fate. He got what he deserved. Joe looked at Tracy and Thomas and said, and y'all ought to be ashamed of yourselves. This never would have happened if y'all would have just stayed together. While we're in these woods, we stick together. Now, if you want to go out and face these monsters alone, you go right ahead. But while you are with us and this group, I'm in charge. And you will either obey my orders or I will have you shot. Tracy and Thomas stood there with their heads bowed as Joe walked past them. Now, let's get moving before that thing comes back, or I'll shoot you in the legs and let it eat y'all to slow it down so we can escape. We get the point, said Tracy. So they began to swiftly walk through the woods. Then they found a familiar road again that they had first taken when they entered Widicker Woods. Come on, this must be the way out of here, Joe told them. They walked down the long road looking for shelter or another way out of the town of Widicker. There must be an abandoned house around here somewhere, Tracy stated. Yeah, but just don't go to the plantation. It's not vacant, Joe replied. Joe began to laugh, but just as he did, they heard a stampede of horses roaring down the road, coming up behind them. They looked back and saw rebel soldiers on 9 horses sprinting furiously. Before they had time to jump out of the way, they all fell on the ground in fear, knowing that they were too late to move and would soon be trampled. But as the horses were about to run over them, the horses and soldiers ran right through them, unharming Joe and the others. They turned around and looked at the horses. The horses rode on another 5 seconds, and then completely disappeared. "They were ghosts," Thomas said. "Thank God they can't hurt us." Then they heard another horse coming. They turned around and seen the headless horseman coming up behind them. "They couldn't hurt us, but he damn sure can. Run!" Joe screamed. They all began to run. This time the headless horseman had an axe instead of a sword. Pastor Toby tried to shoot at him as he ran. "Don't waste your bullets. It won't hurt him," Joe explained as they ran for their lives. Just as the horseman rode up beside Joe and lifted his axe to swing it at him, they heard someone saying, "Over here! Come in here!" They looked to their right and saw an old 2-story wooden house with a woman who looked to be a slave standing on the porch. Joe ducked down to avoid being hit with the horseman's axe. The horseman missed Joe, and the others ran to the house. The woman rushed all of them in. While they got in, they saw another woman standing in the front room. In the room there was a fireplace lit. Everyone gathered around to get warm and dry from the rain. They heard a loud smash at the door. The woman opened the door and saw a smashed pumpkin. Then they saw the headless horseman ride off into the fog. This concludes Chapter 3 of Widicker Woods. Please let me know what you thought in the comments below. If you like this story and want to hear more and listen to more videos just like this, make sure you subscribe, comment, and let me know you want to hear the next chapter. And thank you so much for watching.